So welcome to the afternoon panel. We are going to focus on peace building. I'm Catherine Marshall. I'm at the Berkley Center, veteran from the foundation of the Berkley Center, working primarily on issues of religion and development. And development now includes peace, prosperity, planet, partnerships, and prosperity. So, in other words, the linkages among the many different elements of the global agenda are very much part of that. And increasingly, the issue of fragile states and the issues around conflict are most significant. We have a wonderful panel, again, this afternoon. I will introduce them briefly, and then basically frame the issue a little bit and then put questions to each of the panelists. They've been asked to be brief in their introductions and therefore to allow for an exchange, a conversation as we explore some of the practical issues that we're facing. So to introduce from the far right, not politically, but metaphorically, is Charlie Gardner. He is now working with the United States Council of Catholic Bishops, but he spent many years working with the community of Sant'Egidio and is sort of stamped with the Sant'Egidio model here, and is currently focusing the meeting, the annual Prayer for Peace of the community of Sant'Egidio is starting actually on Sunday with the theme of inclusion. So I think that is at least one of his main focuses. Next to him is Deborah Tonelli, who's been a veteran of this process also. She's a researcher at the Institute of Religious Studies at the Fondazione Bruno Kessler. She's also an invited lecturer in political philosophy and theology at the Pontifical Athenaeum of St. Anselm and at the Pontifical Gregorian University. And her research and teaching activities are focused on the interaction between politics and religion, particularly in the context of interreligious dialogue and religious violence. She's been coordinating the Exiting Violence Project since 2013, which is awe-inspiring. Next to her is Antti Pintakainen, who is currently at the Center for Theological Inquiry, focusing on many issues, including, I think, reconciliation and mediation. We'll find out more about what he's actually doing now. He has been the executive director of the Network of Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, which the secretariat has been hosted by Finchurch Aid and involves the Finnish government, but it's one of many significant networks that have emerged to try to bring the different threads of religious engagement across this broad agenda together. So he has been a leader in that and has been working quite closely with various parts of the United Nations, including the Civil Society Advisory Committee, and has also been working with the Prime Minister of Finland on issues of migration and most recently on issues with the Sami, the minority community in Finland. And last, but again, by no means least, is Wolfgang Palaver, who reminded me that we were on a panel together in 2016. He managed to pin it down. And he is also at the center, the Princeton Center for Theological Inquiry. I guess his more normal life is professor of Catholic social thought at the University of Innsbruck, where he's also the dean of the Faculty of Theology. And it says is here. He previously served as director of the Institute of Systematic Theology at Innsbruck, as well as chair of the Interdisciplinary Research platform, World Order, Religion, Violence. Outside of Innsbruck, Palaver is also the chair of the working group Politics, Religion, Violence at the Austrian Research Association. And he's been, I think, very much involved in some of the issues in Austria. So we bring a European focus. So to focus or to sort of introduce this, we're hoping to move a little, somewhat, given the composition of the panel, I'm not sure how successful we'll be, from the theology and the intellectual questions around violence and peace towards practical as dimensions. And the way that I frame that sometimes is inspired by a comment by former President Ramos of the Philippines, who talked about a particular Philippine cake where you need all the right ingredients. You have to mix them all together, but you then need fire from above, by which we mean leadership and the intellectual heist, but also fire from below. Which is essentially looking to the community level. So I think what we're trying to explore is how this fire from above and fire from below come together in either more successful cases or in cases where we perhaps have something to learn. Wanted to comment briefly on the term peace building around the United Nations Day of Peace, which took place, I guess, on the 21st of September. There was something of a campaign to have the word peace building recognized in the dictionary, because at the moment it's not officially a word, even though it is quite commonly used. So what is this about? And it is about the sense that you can make peace at a table, or you can keep peace, possibly with some kind of peacekeeping force, or you can preserve peace, or you can prevent conflict, or any of these other things, but that the process of peace, in fact, is one that involves building peace constantly, continuously, over time, so a task that is never finished. I think another dimension of it was something I referred to in the very first words that I mentioned here, which is the sense that you have, yes, the peace table, you have the diplomats, the negotiators, whether they're track 1, track 1.5, track 2, or even track 3. I've even heard now a track 4, different levels of peace building. But that the processes of development, processes of education, processes, even the challenges that are linked to the environment, are inseparable parts of this process of building peace. And they are seen in many ways from different perspectives. And I think that we will have a chance during this panel discussion to hear some of these different perspectives. I want to make an apology in the beginning, which is that my class starts at 3:30 downstairs, so I will, in fact, end this very promptly, or at least I will exit very promptly, though possibly members of the panel will choose to continue beyond that. Well, you can, I'm sure we'll have a volunteer. So let me start with the far right and ask Charlie, what do you understand by inclusive peace? You can, I think you will, tell us about some of the distinctive features of the community of Sant'Egidio approach to peace building. In its many dimensions, but how now from your new seat, with a somewhat broader perspective, perhaps the Catholic Peacebuilding Network perspective, how do you see these issues?
Can everyone hear me all right? Or maybe I'll move it closer. How is that? Better? Wonderful. First, Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, to be able to represent the community of Sant'Egidio and share a little bit about our experiences and some learning that we've had over the past 50 years since we started. I think the work of this conference of trying to understand the role that religion has in both promoting and countering violence and exiting violence is always one that is pertinent, and always needs new conversation and be open to dialogue and open to each other's perspectives. And this work of dialogue is never over. We must always make an effort to share our visions, our beliefs, our commitments. And so, yeah, so I'm very honored to be able to contribute a little bit, at least, to this conversation. And I think the focus of my initial remarks will really be looking at how peace building requires solidarity. To quote John Paul II, solidarity is not a vague feeling of compassion or shallow distress at misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and preserving determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, the good of all, of each and every individual, because we are really responsible for all. I think oftentimes the community of Sant'Egidio is most well known for our work in conflict mediation, most famously in Mozambique in '92, but not to exclude, the Burundi process in the '90s and working in the Balkans, the Algerian platform. There's been about a couple dozen national peace and reconciliation efforts. But all this work, while mediating peace has been a dimension of our work, our daily life has always been really with the poor. Our work is building peace at the international level arose from a striving to live in solidarity with the poor across the world and the poor countries. For instance, our work in Mozambique arose from a friendship with a priest, a young Mozambican priest who was in Rome, went back to Mozambique, became a bishop and asked for help. And we began to address helping to bring development to the country, bringing assistance and international aid, but realizing all efforts are hollow if we aren't also addressing the issues of the war that were ravaging the country. But in all activities, we try to build this culture of solidarity. Our work extends beyond conflict resolution. We have been working against the death penalty for 20 years, a very important work for peace. That arose from a friendship with a man on death row in Texas. Our work piloting a refugee resettlement program in Europe arose from our close work with the church in the Middle East and are really being moved to compassion about the sight of all the migrants moving from Syria and so forth. And so as I kind of focus a little bit, we understand that violence in the world is multifaceted. And religion's role must not only to be exit from violence, but also to respond to it in a multifaceted way. The media-saturated world of today is prone to sensationalize violence, even when perpetrated by relatively a few. And it can be amplified disproportionately. And so a small group is in position to inflict war, destabilize a country, terrorize a population, and affect its culture by fostering mistrust, contempt, and bigotry. There's also a violence that is an everyday experience for those at the margins of megacities, abandoned in the slums or isolated in the bush. While populations live under the influence of armed groups, which threaten not only physical violence, but also deprive people of their rights, opportunities for development, and hope for their future. Today, we are faced with widespread violence of organized crime, yet decentralized character, including mafia groups, drug trafficking, youth gangs, and also sudden riots, lynching, and other such volatile moments. And really hundreds of thousands of people are caught by violence in its daily practice. And unfortunately, in many parts of the world, people are draw from the religion justification for this violence. In Latin America, there's a rise of cults of Santa Muerte. Central African Republic, religions have served the reference for Silica and Antibalica. And of course, you can think of Daesh and the Middle East and Syria and Iraq. religions can act as a fuel that propels the fire of violence or waters that extinguish it. So the role, violence is countered really by the role of those who dialogue, those who are faithful to the promise to be present to one another. About a few years ago, the founder of the community of Sant'Egidio, Andrea Riccardi, shared these remarks at a conference we organized on religion and violence. And he said, "It would be a great mistake to reduce the issue of violence to theological questions or the original message of religions to assert one religion has violence in its chromosomes while another is inherently immune to it. No religion is condemned to violence per se, and all religions are affected by it. They are tempted and sometimes overwhelmed by it, while in other cases they resist it and free humanity from its grip." There is an alternative to this seduction of violence in the logic world, which many tenaciously hold fast. In today's globalized world, if a small group can use religion to justify and amplify violence, then surely a handful of people can be in the position to bring about peace. This is the path in which the community of Sant'Egidio has striven. Religions can be a resource for peace and should be engaged more boldly. And we are all called upon to witness of peace, peace seekers, peacemakers, and peace builders. And I think one role of religion in particular is beyond intervening in dialogue and these peacemaking, as Catherine put it, but really to move people to compassion. Earlier this year, Pope Francis had said that the enemy against which we must fight is not hatred in all its forms, but even more fundamentally, indifference. For if indifference that paralyzes and impedes us from doing what is right, even when we know that it is right. And so he continued to say that that indifference is really a virus that is a dangerous, contagious in our times. That even as we are becoming more globalized and more connected to each other, we are really become more tired of seeking one another. And so, as Catherine had mentioned, in a few days' time, the community of Sant'Egidio is really undertaking one of our largest annual gatherings, and really to help promote peace and bring about dialogue. And this is the spirit of Assisi, which started in 1986 by Pope John Paul II, and carried on for the past 31 years by the community of Sant'Egidio. And this year's theme is building bridges of peace. And it explores how we can build a world of peace which is truly inclusive for everyone. And the themes include both direct interventions as well as really how to be more socially inclusive. And it involves not only hundreds of religious and political and cultural leaders, but also thousands of youth from around the world. And it is really an opportunity to help people become more attuned and more passionate and more caring for the issues that are facing our day, that are important, and really overcoming this contagion of indifference. One last thought. Our contemporary world, even though as it is more connected, is also becoming more fragmentized. And I think religions is one of the few transnational organizations that really can unite people, even as more nationalist ideology are coming to fruit. Religions have a role that can unite people and bring people together in a way. So, and I think it does it even more as it remains true to really the foundations, at least within Catholicism, to the need to be in solidarity with the poor, have a presence for, and live in close proximity. The work that Sant'Egidio has always really been when we've been sitting next to living with the poor, trying to be in solidarity. We have come into perspective new needs, new challenges, and understanding that the only way we can really show our compassion, show our care, is to not only respond to direct needs, but also the macro needs and the systemic needs that affect the world. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. One of the early comments I heard when I started working on these issues of religion in public affairs was someone who said that the community of Sant'Egidio is rather the way we would hope religious institutions would always be. So the next time I'm going to ask you for some of the harder lessons.
Okay.
But for the moment, let's turn to Deborah Tonelli. We're going to go to a specific part of the world, I think, largely to the subcontinent and to some of the seemingly persistent challenges of the Dalit and other lower caste communities and the role that religion and Christianity, I guess, specifically can play.
Thank you. First of all, before to start to answer these questions, I'd like to thank my director, Giancarlo Bosetti, Jose Casanova, and Gerard Mannion for trusting in this project and for this second conference on exiting violence. Thank you very much to be here and to give us this opportunity, this possibility. And to answer to your question, Catherine, I need to clarify that I am studying Christian Dalit rebellion, starting by a biblical and philosophical political background. I am not a political scientist. I am a scholar on biblical and political philosophy. But I think that theology and political philosophy can contribute to give tools to understand the Dalit rebellions in the last decades. And as you told, of course, Dalit rebellions is a challenge for peace because nothing is solved for them. In 1915, the birth of the Indian constitution included Dalit in the society, but in fact, the Dalit remained excluded by civil society. And we have some official documents by Christian Church about the opportunity to include Dalits in the Christianity. But if we check the real situation of Dalits in India, we discover that nothing is changed. There is a peace-building process to include the Dalits in society at the level of leadership, but the local situation is completely different. And there is a very big gap among leader and daily life. And just looking for in internet, I found many articles speaking about Dalit rebellions. In 2016, a very big protest of Dalit broke out against the violence, because they are not only the lowest caste in Indian system, but they are less than animals. They are not human beings. So the idea of human dignity is not part of the interpretation of Dalits in the society. This is very important because after this Dalit rebellion, the Christian Church proposed an official document to counter violence against Dalits. But nothing changed for Dalits. For example, often they are not part of Christian liturgy. And it's very strange because they cannot attend the Christian liturgy, but the 70% of Christians in India is Dalit, has a Dalit background. What does it mean, this? How can interpret this situation? I think that as you told starting this conversation, the peace building, the peace is not a conquest, it is a process, a building. We have a peace table to discuss about peace. Anyway, what does it mean in this process is a new kind of education of the people, of the Indian people, to permit the starting of a bottom-up process to include the Dalit in the society. And why it is important, it's so important, their inclusion, not only in the frame of human dignity, but also because the 16% of Indian people is Dalit. It means 200 million person, 200 million human being is Dalit. And considering the economical growing of Indian society and the democracy of India, of course, this contradiction is really strong and put many questions, not only in Asia, but also for the West. So, thank you.
I think you've put the issue of inclusion very squarely on the agenda there, in a very dramatic form, in highlighting the challenges that still face the Dalit. Antti, I think it would be interesting for you to tell us a little bit about why you got involved in the network in the beginning, but also the issues that you're focusing on now, which I think are particularly the inside, outside, the issues of mediation, and how you're defining mediation in the messy context of today's conflicts and where you see the religious dimensions.
Thanks, Catherine. And to be truthful for the previous panel and statements made there, and to honor the topic of the conference, I would like to start with a few remarks. If we believe it's true what was said, we are facing the very uncomfortable question, which Riccardi gave an answer, the opening remarks also reflected to, but is what is wrong with religion when it has become and continues to become the embodiment of justification for violence, and not only justification, but also to be the carrier of the legacy for new generations. And how is it possible that we believe in the civility of ourselves, continuing to accept that legacy while belonging to these institutions? What's wrong with religious people that we are not confronting this? And can we truly recover from violence unless doing the homework within the religious communities? I've had the fortune of being at the Center for Theological Inquiry and faced some extraordinary, complicated questions. Wolfgang, last week or 2 weeks ago, based on Girard's work, put us ask question about the crucifixion. Who needed this? Was it God or man? Yesterday, was it yesterday? 2 days ago, a couple of days ago, David Toombs brought the question of possibility of sexual assault towards Christ amidst of the crucifixion, the stripping, what happened in the barracks, and even the crucifixion itself, and the silence, basically the sanitation of that in a way that we carry an element of humiliation sanitized with us. And how would our understanding of church be different if we would have accepted and not sanitated that level of humiliation? Dr. Butler referred to the rainbow, saying this country can't love rainbow without continuing the suppression. I and Terence had a little discussion during the lunch on reconciliation. How do you deal with your dark side? Because none of us becomes just field of light. There is some darkness we all carry. I would just want to reflect to the essence of light which I somehow learned in the context of South Africa, which used to be black and white society with some twist of color, that the essence of light is to expose color. Every beam of light carries every color. And how does it change our understanding of where light is needed and what's the purpose of light if it's to celebrate every color? And in my humble experience, the biggest celebration and source of hope is this human struggle and commitment to try, that every human being has potential to. So how does that then reflect to our struggle within the religions? How do we need to rethink what religion is in order to create pathway out of a very complicated era of violence? I would say the bottom line question to what I'm trying to discuss is that, do we have a chance to get out of the violence? So Katrin asked something about my previous work, and the network she mentioned was established on our decade-long work in Somalia, which started when it was the Syria of the time, where it was too dangerous and there was no hope, where through working with the tribal leaders and religious leaders, a grassroots movement towards peace was created that was able, despite the violence, create trust that then gave rebirth to the national institutions and ended the transition. And the only missing piece in that plan was negotiations with Al-Shabaab, which haven't yet happened. Which led the United Nations to believe that religious communities and tribal communities can play a significant role. And we primarily refer to the Somali traditional Islamic and tribal teaching of Her as a methodology of dealing with conflict. We have the same in Libya, in Solha. And it's remarkably beautiful to think that in this very complex and violent situation of Libya, for failed states and a lot of competing militias striving to kill even more, you have an existence of perhaps thousands of years of legacy of how do you actually resolve these issues, and how blind it is from the UN when they're building the state not to trust and have this as a foundation what's being built, rather than having artificial meetings with militia or political leaders. So that's how much there needs to be fixing in the UN. My definition of mediation could be simplified into saying peace requires 1,000 efforts, of which 950 will eventually fail to achieve the goal, but 50 will be extremely critical, 30 of them partially helpful, and the final 20 will actually achieve the peace. So peace is never just one initiative, and this is where we come into the role of religions. You will never achieve this big peace unless those 950 efforts that failed were not done, that led into the opportunity of peace and the aftermath. I would like to, however, finally focus a bit on my current challenge that I've taken, is to understand what is the process that we call reconciliation, based on the experience of South Africa, and then becoming a reference in almost every peace process. 75% of the UN Security Council missions, peacekeeping missions and political missions, claim that reconciliation should be the goal. But United Nations doesn't have a single guidance note to explain how do you achieve reconciliation. So the practice varies, and the theory of reconciliation says that there is the spectrum of minimalist to maximalist, with the practical center, minimalist being where two parties agree to live in peace but don't want to create a new relationship, while in the maximalist there is a transformational process. And there is very little practical experiences showing how you can achieve a transformative change. However, when you look into grassroots, you have a lot of practice. It seems like anything I'm coming up has been practiced for so long. So why is there this disconnect of somehow really helpful community-based practices not playing out in a broader change? And so we're trying to collect some of the ideas and simultaneously test them. And that's where my role in the Finnish reconciliation process may have been helpful. So I proposed to the government and the Sami that we run 3 simultaneous tracks along each other, having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that can potentially collect the evidence, pinpoint what happened, give space for the stories of the victims and the truth to come on the surface, and for the perpetrator, the state, and those who were behind the persecution to go through the painful process of realizing what they had done. As Dr. Terence said, that may not necessarily lead into change. So you have to keep them in that uncomfortable situation where this change of narrative and realization leads into changing relationships in community level, which we are approaching by training what we call insider reconcilers from the communities between the fault lines to be given equipment and tools to mediate and reconcile those conflicts. So creating a community of practice. In the Finnish scale, it's a couple hundred people, so it's not a massive endeavor. I've done my first pilot training and extremely promising results. And then the third layer track is focusing on the need of psychosocial care and recovery, expression of the pain, the loss, and storytelling, which hopefully being executed 3 at the simultaneous time, and the 2 later continuing indefinitely, where the state commits to provide financing for them, led by the Sami themselves, I believe can potentially achieve better transformative change in society. So let me maybe end here, just with the question, if there is a chance that we will not have an opportunity to leave an era of violence, if it's, like I add in my definition of reconciliation, it's dependent on a moment in time, which limited. So history gives chances for communities to reconcile that usually are exploited by those who either had the power or will or strive for the power. If it's such a short moment that reconciliation is possible, but with that huge effort of transformative potential, why is it that we're investing in it so little? Why isn't it made a dominant area of research, teaching and practice? Why is it left to coincidence? That I really can't understand.
Thank you. Wolfgang, I'm not sure where you want to start in your various threads, but I know the 2 that we exchanged about. One is, in a sense, one of the puzzles of the Austrian experience and the work that you're doing there and where you see that taking. And again, the sort of perennial question we're asking, what's religion got to do with it? And then you also have followed quite closely the Focolare experience, which is another philosophy, but also practical approach. So you might share some of that with us as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to Jose. I was for many years looking forward to see where our honorary doctor really works, and I think it's a nice and very good place. I want to emphasize a little bit, not exclusionary, but as a basic precondition of interreligious dialogue, the dialogue of life. And I will outline very shortly the importance of the dialogue of life, and then I will give 2 examples, one from Austria, from my own village, so very local, and then a second example on a more international, interreligious dialogue in the framework of the Focolare movement. I'm also strongly committed to Pax Christi. That should not be overlooked, but this is not now the topic I want to address. When Charlie referred us, and that made me aware of something, that this important Assisi meeting of 1986 that was so crucial for the Catholic Church. We all remember that Cardinal Ratzinger was a little bit worried what John Paul II is going to do there. One of the first important documents of the Congregation of Interreligious Dialogue in the Vatican, I think in preparation of Assisi 1986, released a document in 1984 where they distinguished 4 forms of dialogue. The dialogue of life, where people strive to live in an open and neighborly spirit, sharing their joys and sorrows, their human problems and preoccupations, the dialogue of life. The second dialogue, the dialogue of action. The third dialogue, the dialogue of theological exchange. And the fourth dialogue, the dialogue of religious experience. All the 4 dialogues are important, but I will focus now on the dialogue of life, which is in some way a basis. Where there is no dialogue of life, the other dialogues cannot really take place and flourish. So Pope Francis, in his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium of 2013, when he, in the chapter where he addresses interreligious dialogue, he also emphasizes the dialogue of life. He writes, "This dialogue is in first place a conversation about human existence, or simply, as the bishops of India have put it, a matter of being open to them, sharing their joys and sorrows." And one of the most striking examples of a lived dialogue of life is the experience of the monks of Tibirine in Algeria, those monks who were killed. We still do not know who killed them, probably more likely the state security, maybe by accident. But nevertheless, this community, led by the Father Christian de Cherchez, they emphasized very strongly the dialogue of life. So they lived with their community in the Muslim world in Algeria, and Christian de Cherchez, and you can read that in John Keyser's book, The Monks of Tibirine. He writes, "Knowledge puffs up, love edifies. Knowledge puffs up, love edifies. We never took the initiative. The dialogue came of itself, the fruit of living together with Muslims over a long period of time." They often said to them to practice the 5th gospel, meaning the gospel lived rather than preached. "We avoid theological discussions," Christian de Cherchez continued in his report to Father Maurice Bormans, who was his teacher in Rome, "because theological discussions lead to intellectual sparring that gets in the way of getting to know one another. All the little daily gestures of goodwill speaks for themselves. Sharing our water, a piece of bread, a friendly handshake says much more about what we can do together than do theological tomes." So probably many of you have seen the movie based on the experience of these fathers. And this movie also emphasizes very much the importance of this dialogue of life. When I emphasize the dialogue of life, I do not undermine my own preoccupation as a teacher and a theologian, but I think we should be aware how these different dialogues relate to each other. And I give you very briefly 2 concrete examples. The first example, very local example from my own village, the interreligious cooperation in Jenbach, in a village with 7,000 inhabitants. The majority of it is Catholic, about 4,800. There are many different religions in this little village present, but there are more than 1,000 Muslims also coming from different branches, so also Alevites are counted in this 1,100. I was for about 10 years the chair of the parish council, And after a couple of years, and it's not easy, we have to learn that, we said we should do something. I mean, these are people who live here for 30 years, but there was no dialogue. Nothing was going on. We didn't know their name. We didn't know their occupation. We didn't know nothing. So we invited them, and out of this invitation is now a 10-year project. We organized an annual interreligious feast. And the most important and striking experience was the core team organizing this feast that consisted of members of different religion. And this is some kind of a dialogue of life, because you get to know each other. We became friends. We share sorrows. We share joys. And it's much more important and the first step compared to starting to, what do you think about Trinity? And you don't have the Trinity, we have the Trinity, and what does it mean, and so on. Those questions later on can become important, but the first thing is to live together. And one of the problems in many European countries, especially in Austria, is that the people don't know each other. Muslims don't get invited by the ordinary Austrians. Austrians might get invited by Muslims, or it's more likely in that direction, but they are afraid and what will happen to us and so on. So these things are very important to strengthen. It's also, the dialogue of life is important because this kind of local living together, local dialogue is asymmetric. So this village I'm living in is a traditional workers' village with a long tradition of a big social democratic majority. But now those who are working in this workers' village are the Muslims. And the traditional social democratic party has problems to connect their emphasis on being a workers' party with the Muslims there. So the Muslims in my village are workers, and I'm a professor at the university, so I cannot just start with what I'm doing on my desk in the university and address my colleagues there. It has to be a form of dialogue of life. Last year, for the first time, we organized our feast as a green event with very clear criteria of how many places, so this would not be allowed, and, and other things. It was a great experience, and then we could go a step further, because when we prepared this green event, and it took us a whole year, we draw on our religious traditions. So in one of the evenings where we convene all the different religions, it's more than just Catholics and Muslims, we just had about 10 minutes. What is our tradition saying on environmental issues, protection of creation, and so on, preparing for then understanding that plastic bottles and other things is not the proper way to conduct the feast. The second example, Christian-Muslim dialogue in the framework of the Focolare movement. The Focolare movement, maybe you do not know, but one of the interesting things is that they are engaged in Christian-Muslim dialogues for many, many years. So there was already before 9/11 a big meeting in the United States between Farrakhan and Chiara Lubich, the founder of this Catholic, but going beyond Catholic movement, emphasizing very strongly fraternity and unity. And there are even quite a large number of Muslims being member of the Focolare movement. 30 years ago, the more critical left-wing Catholics like myself were a little bit distancing from the Focolare, because they were always talking about love and they were so nice and so on, but not political and left-wing enough. But when I later met them and so on, I saw that in regarding interreligious dialogue, they did much more than we just said and talked about. And they were also trying to help the Austrian population to get to a better understanding between Christian and Muslims. So in 2010, 8 years ago, we had a big meeting in Innsbruck where we invited scholars from Muslim scholars and Christian scholars. We repeated that a year later. And after that, we have now organized for the last 6 years, every year, a 1-week meeting of about 15 people, some Muslim scholars, some Christian scholars, some members of the Focolare movement, especially those experts of interreligious dialogue, as intermediaries of giving the framework. And also in this case, this is now more an academic interreligious dialogue, but also, I mean, if we meet as we meet here for the first time probably and just have 15 minutes, the most usual thing what's happened, and that's should not worry us, is a misunderstanding, because we do not know each other, we don't know the background, the context and so on, so it's always a lot of misunderstanding. But if you do it a week long and repeat that over years, then trust is building up, and then you can also slowly address really more difficult questions. So the Muslim participants were Shahzad Hushmand and Adnan Mokrani. Maybe some of you know them, who are teaching in Rome. There was also Zainab Aydin, who was the Gülen movement representative, or still is, in Rome. There is Roman Siebenrock from my own faculty. So what we experienced is that in order to have dialogue, interreligious dialogue, you have to build up trust, and that means it's very good to eat together, to stay together for a week, to do some tourism together and have some exchange, listen to, I remember 2 years ago, we were going to Switzerland in a bus for about 3 hours, and Adnani Mukrani was listening to music on his phone. And I said, may I hear what you are listening? And it's one of the music things I listen now myself. And all those things are a very important precondition then for going deeper into theological and more philosophical questions. So, yeah. So that's my emphasis on the dialogue of life.
Well, that's a wonderful segue to what I hope to frame as our second round of discussion, which is inviting us all to dig a little bit deeper into what it is that we're learning. I don't say have learned, but what it is that we're learning. I think there are a number of puzzles that turn around these kinds of discussions that come up in many settings. A straightforward one, which I think in a sense is the theme of the conference overall, is the phenomenon we've witnessed where you will hear vehemently one group of people saying this is a conflict that has absolutely nothing to do with religion, whether it's Central African Republic or the Rohingya issue or Nigeria or any other, Austria. And then others who will say, yes, but the data shows us that people think that it does have to do with religion. How do you have the kind of thoughtful analysis that's needed to get beyond what are obviously the complexities of the interrelationship of different issues, which I think Deborah has also focused on, that it's never purely about religion, nor is it ever purely about pastoralists eating the crops of farmers or a competition of resources. I think another puzzle that we have is, and again, I think we're in a group here where there is generally a sense that the religious values and religious leadership, religious training offers answers and is a path to peace, that it, with the full humility that Antti highlighted and that others have highlighted with the historic and the other flaws. But there are large groups of people who see it otherwise, who have deep skepticism. So what is it that can be learned from that discourse? In a practical sense, there was a period, I think, up to about maybe 3-4 years ago, when the basic narrative was that the world was becoming more peaceful and that the zones of conflict were narrowing. That has changed. And the fact is, I think that at least 50% of conflicts where there's a celebration and a signing of treaties, at least half of them, if not more, are seeing resumed violence. So that, and the final comment that I want to put on the table is it's a frustration in many of these discussions that we do have, as we have tomorrow morning, a panel on the role of women. But that is, it seems an anomaly in 2018 that those issues are seen as something distinct and separate, that they're not woven into the discussion. So if we're talking about inclusion, clearly the obvious candidates are young people and women, or women and young people, depending on your estimates of the size of the population, et cetera, and the degree of exclusion. But let's challenge ourselves to say, what more do we need to know? What is it that we don't know? What needs to be looked at in terms of making it building peace as opposed to making peace, or even reconciling tensions? Do you want to start on to you?
Yeah, I'll actually start with the term peace building, which I'm sure has many roots and history, but one of them is the aftermath of South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission with the peace committees. And what they learned, which Catherine referred to in her opening, was that when you came from outside, convene a group of actors and made a deal, it didn't lead to change. But when there was community-based involvement activities and building up the momentum where peace then could be achieved, it sustained. So that created, in that context, the peace building term, which was then applied in the peace committees. Well, I had a chance of being with one of the leaders of this movement, Mark Manley, in a workshop, and he then recalled how the ANC government abolished the peace committees for an unknown reason. I don't know the reason. So basically what was achieved in community level and should have been advanced was stopped. So that's kind of providing a caveat to the terminology. Your question on, is it about religion, and the deeper questions, what Isaac Svensson has provided us for years is the understanding of the change in the nature of the conflict. So the traditional conflicts have ceased, we have less. And it seems the tools we have for fixing those traditional conflicts function. But they are applied to a new set of conflicts, which are identity-based conflicts. And their number has increased in the same amount. So basically we are in a situation where we're applying all tools to new problems, and we don't have yet the new tools. So that's a challenge for us as community of practitioners and academics.
So what do we do?
Identity-based conflicts, how do you resolve them? And like I said, reconciliation framework is one of those that has been identified potentially as a pathway out of identity-based conflicts, transforming the relationships. But then the question I raised, that if your ideology is prominently dominating, striving for dominance and promoting violence, how able are you into that type of transformative process? So I think we have a long way to go, and there is clearly a lot of homework that needs to be done within the religious communities. Like the opening remark or Ricardo said, every religion struggles with this. And so the honest voices within every religion to hold their own faith accountable and to be inspiring, taking distance what holds violence so close, has to be advanced.
Charlie, do you want to reflect this community? You emphasized how many conflicts the community has been involved in. Is what if you had a, let's pretend we're in a closed Sant'Egidio meeting, what would be the lessons that you think people see? What's different now? What has been learned from these many experiences?
I think one thing that has that Wolfgang and both Antti and Wolfgang highlighted on is the cumulative need to build dialogue, how dialogue isn't just a one-time occasion. It just isn't a simple success story and failure story. But even now, as the narrative of the world becoming more peaceful is changing, you are beginning to see the reversion to violence where places that were once thought peaceful, like Mozambique is a great example of how after 20 years of peace, almost immediately there was an outbreak, struggle for more resources, disillusionment because certain people weren't allowed power, and all these different conversations that were struggle. But the thing that the success too about dialogue is that I think we need to let people need to begin to dream that peace is possible, that like Mozambique, even though there was an outbreak of conflict after 20 years, the framework of dialogue was still there, and people were still holding on to that dream and remember what the war was like and what it is now, and realizing and beginning to appreciate peace in their society. So even though there was frustration at not being fully inclusive of sharing of resources and building up a society, the promises felt like they weren't quite there. Like the framework of dialogue has persisted, and I think that's what we really need to do. Like help people. Like San Egidio's method is to let people know that there is another way to address issues other than war, and that war is really just gonna further poverty, the mother of poverty. And so, helping to have people be transformed from guerrillas to political actors is something very fundamental to the work that we do throughout all our mediations and interventions. But I think with that, it's so important to have this peace building development at the local level. Otherwise, there's going to continue to be a disconnect between what is written on the table and what are the lived experiences too. And so, peace building, war and violence are multifaceted, and peace building needs to be multifaceted. It needs to be at the table. It needs to help people to dream. It needs to help shift their identities from guerrilla to political actors, but also needs to build a culture with education where people have opportunities, where people can begin to hope for their own future. Because when you don't have that, then you begin to revert to some of these old trends to change the system that are unjust. So, yeah.
I would just add one of my personal frustrations is the intensity of the silos that separate the different worlds, that so few of the peace processes really involve creative thinking about the development possibilities and agendas. I'm not sure, Antti and Charlie, whether this is a fair question because it's fairly detailed, but at one stage there is some reviews of different efforts at reconciliation following a peace process. And Mozambique, in some ways, was held out as a case where there was no formal accountability or reconciliation process, where people basically just sort of went back to life without any formal structure at all, possibly with traditional methods. That was viewed as an asset. In other words, that was seen at one point as a positive point. How, looking back, would you see that? I don't know if either of you.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer. I can provide some context of how I understood it, that within the traditional view of Mozambique, violence was actually seen as a sickness. Like the war was a sickness of the villages, of the towns, of the country, and peace was a vaccine, and it cured. And so, in many ways, it did allow for some reintegration, and within this traditional framework. So I think the peace process used traditional framework that Mozambican had to understand how to go beyond that and not to mull it. But I think as we can see with many things, you need this reconstruction. You need some accountability that I think we have definitely begun to grapple with and understanding how we need to continue to integrate in our processes.
I would refer to tomorrow's panel, basically posing the question for those discussing Northern Ireland, that was it a failed, missed opportunity that will possibly lead into, with the complications of Brexit, to a new wave of violence. So how dangerous it is to accept for political or comfortable reasons the communities not to transform their relationships, but agree to live together. So maybe I think that's another reflection. I'd love to speak later on to the methodologies more, but I'll let Catherine, you lead us further.
Deborah, do you, as you think, have reflected, because you've been reflecting on this since 2013, I guess, are there areas of lessons or areas that you see as ones that we should be focusing on in the future arising from these discussions?
For peace building. In some way, I think that all world is involved in the question of peace building with a question mark. What does it mean, peace building? And sometimes I asked to myself, what does it mean, peace? To live in a world without international conflicts, a way of spiritual harmony, or in which way it's possible to realize a way of peace building together. And from my point of view, I think, yes, the Asia, in particular India, is the most important challenge that we have now, together with the African continent. And I think that it depends in particular from our point of view. With this fashion of peace building built in the West, after the Second World War, we understood that our military task force were too much strong to survive, and that the dangers for the future was real. So, but at the same time, we are trying to impose our idea and our criteria for peace building in the rest of the world. And we are not ready, for example, to discuss, to engage our relationships with the tribal communities, for example. For the West, is easier to engage a discussion with the national state, but Asia and Africa show us that the tribal communities still working in some part of the world, and they make the dialogue of peace building difficult. And the religious pluralism, it is another challenge that now we have to consider in the West, not only in Europe, in Africa, in everywhere, I think. But the interreligious dialogue is a dialogue just among leaders or among communities. And what does it mean, engage an interreligious dialogue among the people inside the nation? For example, in Italy, we are traditionally Catholic. As I tell, we have the Vatican at home. My family's house is close to the Vatican, so and the Pope is my neighbor in some way. No, it's strange, but it's so. If I want to go out, yes, the same. But it means that if I want to go around in the town, I have to check if the Pope is going out too, because the traffic is terrible. It's real. But now with immigration, with the multicultural societies and so, our small nation is changing also. And the interreligious dialogue is urgent at all levels. And I think that we have to overcome a Western or Eurocentric vision of the problems. when I started to speak before, I told you that I meet these questions of Dalits rebellion, starting by the role of biblical hermeneutics in socio-political conflicts. And working as biblical scholars, I understood, I saw that our theology and our theological frame are really Eurocentric, and it's really hard to engage a theological conversation, discuss value or criteria with citizenship coming from other part of the world, because we are not able to imagine and to accept that in other countries the people is using other criteria as another mentality, another kind of emergency. And I think that in some way every continent, every country that has to find the solutions for religious pluralism, for analphabetism, for international or national conflicts, in some ways has to be engaged in a discussion on peace building. But it means also that we have not only find a solution, as it would be an agreement. We have to change our perspective. The inclusion of Dalits in Indian society show this. To include the Dalits, we need to change the mentality of Indian society. And this is a really deep changing inside India. But in some way, it is a metaphor for all country, all the world. So in particular, where the problems of poverty, of course, the emergency of this dialogue is more important. But in some way, I think that using these criteria, education, interreligious dialogue, and the overcoming of a Eurocentric and Western vision, we can engage a peace table.
Wolfgang, you focused very much on what you see as critical for dialogue, which is patient, human, continued, with a long-term perspective and vision. On these puzzles, do you have any specific reflections? And I would be interested, since I do want to bring it in, how women have been involved in the kinds of dialogue processes that you were discussing. Have the traditional patterns of exclusion of women been overcome? Then, just so that everyone knows, I want to give Antti 1 minute afterwards to at least introduce the methodology issue that he's eager to, and then open it up for discussion.
Okay. Interestingly, in both the examples I explained, women play an important role. So let's start with the second example, the interreligious dialogue in the framework of the Focolare movement. The Focolare movement is special because the leader of the Focolare movement, or the founder, was a woman, and the current president is also a woman, and I think they even have a constitution now that it has to be a woman. And so the women play an important role. So you have, wherever there are Focolare communities, you have a community of men and you have a community of women. And so therefore also our group consists of men and women, quite balanced. And as I told you, one of the Muslim scholars is Shahrazad Houshmand, who is an expert on Mary in Quran. So this was also a very interesting half day or so when she just told us and explored how important the role of Mary in Quran is. And this is just astonishing if you have never reflected on that. It's the only woman in the Quran that's mentioned by name, and she is an important role. So it's also interesting from a Christian point of view, because you think you have to tell the Muslims about Mary or Jesus, but they know already from their own tradition quite a lot, and just to see that is important.
But do you I know this is a tough question, but with this balance, and I presume you're not saying that they're separate but equal, but do you see any difference in agendas? That implies that there's a comparative focus, but does it bring new issues to the table?
I mean, it's probably another attitude, a softer attitude in some way, bringing other dimensions of life more into the center. Because in our local group, one of the key persons that helped us a lot is a representative of the Baha'i community, Badia Busci, which is a very close friend of mine, and I just saw her a week ago because I had a special birthday, and then we convened some of those people there. And I always have the feeling she's the soul of our group. So, you know, she brings little sweets to our meetings, and she is always in some way very positive. So in those 11 years, I already 50 or 60 times I was completely desperate and said, I stopped that, this doesn't go nowhere. And she is the one who always cheers us up and has the... I cannot, in some way, I think men and women are complementary in their attitudes, and if you have groups, so maybe on a certain level in the Catholic Church, this balance is lacking. And just both of these examples, but I never reflected on that, are examples where the balance is quite good for whatever reasons.
Mm-hmm. Antti?
Catherine, I can't move on without commenting the gender issue. And you know that I think that perhaps one of the biggest collective sins of almost all religions is the marginalization of the women, resulting more of deaths than anything else on a daily basis because of the malnutrition and sicknesses that are a consequence of marginalization and lack of opportunities for women. And all the major religions are contributing to it. However, still referring to the striking panel on blackness, I was at an event where it was said that the white feminists are the factor that maintains the white supremacy in this country, the silence of the white feminists who are sometimes tweeting their concerns, but actually benefiting and not putting their privilege on stake. And that holds white supremacy. So gender is also built in the maintaining of oppressive structures. To honor someone who I think lives in this city, I would like just to speak one methodology. So I think Olga Bochareva lives in the city. If someone knows her, I'd love to get to know her, because I try to apply her methodology, which is quite simple and understandable, where she describes the cycle of violence, cycle of revenge, which is a common trauma therapy approach to human mind, where you basically don't address the loss. You suppress it, and then you still feel it. And to avoid confronting that, you start to look about who caused this, creating a narrative of victimhood and justifying revenge. Like she said, most of the people never go to the violent revenge, but their mind is stuck in it. And how much of violence continues in the cycle of violence, where, in her view, the starting point, she calls there's divine doubt. If you are in a conflict with someone, embrace those moments of doubt. When you name the loss and start to tell the stories, that opens to the space of listening to the story of the other, which leads to the humanizing of the other, which is the core foundation. Storytelling, humanizing, creates the foundation of reconciliation, because then you can discuss the issues that have separated you, and how you can avoid returning to the same situation. And after that, reconciliation becomes possible. So that is just a very quite understandable and very useful methodology that I'm applying currently very effectively.
Great. Well, time for discussion. Yes. Do we need a mic or? Oh.
Yes, I have a general question for all the speakers, and for Charles, for Deborah, for Antti, for Wolfgang, for Catherine too, and for all of us. The general question is that is about why we are now in a season where hate is prevailing over dialogue. Hate is prevailing over dialogue. We have all. Not only violence, yes, violence where in the Middle East we have many situations very hard to, very bloody. But also in the general public arena in Europe and also in North America is dominated by hate, by a polarization where religious forces don't represent, tend to represent more the part of the problem than part of the solution. Like take the evangelical in North America, like take the Hindu in the Indian situation, where now the language of the Hindu elite in India is closer to the one of Nathuram Godse, the killer of Gandhi, than to the Gandhian elite that was in charge before until less than 10 years ago. Now that is the situation we have today, and it's something quite recent that happened lately. Because, look, when we started the Istanbul seminars, we were in a season where we started with Habermas. Was a peak moment of the idea of post-secularism. That means the idea that having a situation of a lack of a political, ideological supply of resources to the public sphere, religions appeared in several situations as a candidate to offer a supply of energies, of resources for a politics lacking of moral resources. In a few years, the situation has changed. The situation was different 10 years ago. I checked now, when we started talking about this conference, was Rosati died 4 years ago, with the beginning of saying, look, make this conference. Was still open the idea of it. And then the polarization and the hate speech prevailed everywhere, and also with some support of religious communities, of a wing of the bad wing of every religion. Why this happened? The question is, what is my question? The question is, does religion represent only? I don't have a solution. Does religion represent a pure reflex of the social, cultural, political situation, and the idea that there was some supplementary resource for a political life in a critical situation was not true?
Well, why don't we tackle that one first and see who'd like to try to talk about the challenges of our time. Clearly, you've put your finger on a broader issue even than the recurrence of violence, which is what I would describe as the situation of fear, the link between fear and hate, I think is, so what are people so afraid of? What is this existential fear? And how is it that, I guess that we should ask the question, how could the interreligious bodies, for example, that try to bring some of these threads together, some of the networks that we were talking about, how should they be responding in trying to address this? So you can take the first.
I would like to address that question because for a couple of 2 or 3 years I'm focusing a little bit on your question. And I think one of the keys to understand this situation, the spirit of our time, is to emphasize or look at the level of fear that is in our world. And I would say that's, of course, quick remarks. We should not forget the influence of 9/11. We should not forget the influence of the financial crisis of 2007-8 that still is continuing. We should, connected to that, not forget the migration crisis in some way. We should not forget the emphasis of scientists on the climate problem. So there are many triggers that increase the experience of at least imagined fear and catastrophe. And there is a very, I try to cut it very short, there's a very interesting group of political psychologists. It's called the terror management theory. It has nothing to do directly with terrorism. It has to do with, there is one trigger of fear that has to do with our life as mortal beings. So we all are in some way afraid of dying. And most of the time we forget, fortunately, about that. But when there are triggers that remind us of that, the political psychologists of the terror management theory show you in situations of threat, it's more likely that we turn to friend-enemy patterns and to scapegoating. And so this is a very strong tendency. And there are already quite good articles in what way religion strengthens that dangerous tendency, and in what way religions can help us out of that. And there is a very good popular book by those guys. It's called The Worm at Our Core. And in this book, they have a very interesting concluding chapter that says black-white patterns, friend-enemy patterns, black-white patterns help us, give us psychologically more security. So therefore, there is always a little tendency to long for black-white patterns, because if we are a group and we are the good ones and the other are the bad ones, that helps us to overcome those fears. But these black-white patterns are very dangerous in living together because they are intolerant and so on. So the authors conclude what we need in our world of today is religions, cultural patterns, worldview that give us the security of black and white, but are tolerant as many shades of gray, not black and white. And I was thinking, I just finished with that, thinking about the Catholic Church. I think the Second Vatican Council tried to do exactly that. The Second Vatican Council was overcoming the black and white pattern of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. If you are not part of the Catholic Church, you are damned forever. With opening, so not giving the Catholic people, of course, the security of salvation, but also teaching them there are many ways of salvation outside the Catholic Church, so it's not a one-way thing. And I think those messages are very important. But if you look at the local level, for instance, also on my local level, the message of the Second Vatican Council, has it reached the grassroots level in the deeper sense? No, not at all. Maybe it will take 50 more years. So in that direction,
Antti raised his hand.
Giancarlo's question, it's very important, and in some way I tried to look into it when I became the special envoy for the Prime Minister in the migration crisis, look into scenarios, because it seems to have come as a surprise, and with a lot of risks in terms of the institutionalized way of working in Europe and so on and so forth. So there had to be some scenarios. And at the time I came to the view that we are just living a historical transition where the failures of past are coming after us. And as any human transition, this has a potential of producing something better. But there is unknown amount of pain that will come to it, and a potential of destruction because of the weapons of mass destruction, and then the climate change adding to this. So I believe we are in the beginning of painful historical transition, and that's a symptom of previous failures and existence of pain that we didn't acknowledge. So what you might be referring to is the feeling of the privilege in the previous era, and their failure of acknowledging that their privilege was based on suffering of the other.
anyone else want to?
So, Giancarlo, thank you for the questions. I don't know the statistic. I am not able to tell you and to confirm you if today we have more violence than before, and if we are more able to eat than to love the people. Anyway, I think that my answer can be based only on my perceptions, informations, newspaper, mass media, languages, and so on. And I think that looking to the past, yes, of course, many things are changed. The failure, some problems are coming out now. And but I am not sure that this age is more violence than other. I think that our perception, our sensibility is playing its role. A few months ago, I was reading the very interesting book of Steven Pinker, The Better Angel of Our Life, Why the Violence is Declined. Of course, it's just his perspective, but it is interesting to consider the opportunity that our capacity to support violence is changed. And as biblical scholar, if I read the Bible, I don't find peace. And the violence is not the question. Why? Because the Bible shows the ambiguity of human being, and human being is composed by violence, peace, and many other sentiments, different approach to the life. It means that we have to be able to do our choice. And as Catherine was told before, the link between fear and violence is really strong. And I think that for someone can be inconvenient to encourage violence and hate against an enemy, because, of course, the building of enemy is part of the building of our identity. In some way, there is this interdependence with the others, if we love them and if we hate them. So try to answer at economical level. Maybe I could ask you why today it seems to us that hate speech and violence is economically convenient to live our life together. Because when we do our choice, we can choose what is convenient for us. Why violence is better than peace? And why our sensibility is changed? And why now, in this age, we do fear the conflict?
Do you mind if I have just a minute?
Sorry, I hadn't seen you with the mic.
So I think, as my other panelists have touched upon, fear, and you pointed to that, there is a spirit of fear that we need to be wary of. And I think going back to the name of this panel is peace building through religious communities. And so I think if we want to build peace, we need to build community. We need to, as Deborah mentioned earlier, that in Italy, there's a need to reach out to the immigrant population before a crisis happens. There's a need to go out and reach out. Aristotle said that people won't even undertake a journey together if they're not friends, much less govern a city. I think this understanding of friendship, of understanding this dialogue of lifestyle that Wolfgang mentioned, that we need to have this basic encounter, basic understanding of how we can live together, that we can live with another, and not to let our identity of enemy be the primary identity of who we go by. And it's not, again, I think we have this story like violence is sensational. You know, it goes through, it's like a fire, flash fire. We all look at it, but no one looks at how a forest grows, you know? I think the work of peace, the work of love is something that we need to cultivate, that we need to build upon it slowly. And we can have opportunities to highlight how we can live together. And that's what San Egidio tries to do with this annual gathering, tries to create a moment where we are, that peace is possible, that is a beautiful, that becomes like a living icon of coexistence. And there's also something, but when you do live in, like how fear can be more energizing, you know, it can be more, become more powerful in our identities. But when you begin to live in community with one another, we get energy from living together. You know, there's a beauty in living together. And I think like none of us can go out in the world and resolve this issue of polarization on our own. The very thought that we can do it on our own is the issue. So I think we need to examine how do we live in community right now? How does that community call us to build communities of and kind of build this network of solidarity throughout our cities and hopefully country eventually and so on.
Well, I think you've opened something of a Pandora's box of a fundamental issue, and certainly it's one that living in the United States, I think most of us have 3 or 4 conversations a day that basically turn on trying to understand what the situation is. I'm just going to interject one thing from the development world, which is that we really should not forget the extraordinary achievements of the past 50 years, past 60 years, which include for almost all of us an extra 20 years of life, the reduction of infant mortality, the extraordinary spread of education, the extraordinary spread of opportunities for vastly larger populations. And it's very easy to lose sight of those facts. And clearly we live in a world in turmoil, where it's fast-paced. I think most of us are finding it difficult to keep up with life. The extraordinary demands and which are part of the opportunities. But this prevailing fear and the failures of the political system at the national, international, I think less at the local level. I think there seems to be more hope at the city, at the community level, and even at the family level. I'm less troubled by families than some people are, but we go on all day, but there are a couple of hands. So Jose, you get them forward.
There was a tinge of kind of a secularist outlook in the way you put the question. Namely, we were in the process of, you know, building this kind of civil society, open, rational society. And of course, we had problems with our own life world reconstruction, and then we put our hopes on religion. But now the religion has failed. So now we blame religion for the crisis we're on, right? So it's a problem. I mean, first, this false hope that the religion is going to the substitute for the things that we couldn't do on a secular basis, and now blaming religion for the fact that we're in such a mess. So this is one thing. The other obviously, since we're talking of gender, and I would like to bring, last week we had the great news that the Nobel Peace Prize was given to persons who basically had put the emphasis on the role of violence against women in practically most conflicts today in the world. So it's something that we will discuss in the panel tomorrow. But I think that one of the greatest reasons to be hopeful is precisely this inclusion of women in many of these aspects, and the extent to which, especially at the grassroots level, they may contribute to this community building in a much better way than what may have been done, without, you know, women being the angels somehow that can save us from this fallen nature, right? We men are the fallen nature, women are not fallen nature. So I think, I don't want to put these examples, but precisely because of the exclusion, the extent to which there is something to it. So I would like to also ask you, because you didn't respond really seriously to the question of gender and peacemaking and the way in which the violence against women, exclusion of women, was part of the problems. And much of the anger, I mean, not much of the fear today. We see the rage, the male rage also at precisely at women's rights and this demand for women inclusion. This is part of the rage we find today in many of these populist movements. I mean, we see it in Bolsonaro in the capital in Brazil is simultaneously saying basically a dead criminal or a good criminal is a dead criminal, but then going against women, going against blacks, going against basically everybody in this construction of an identity. And the anti-feminism, which is so much part of all the transnational moral movement in Europe, you know, basically through the Moscow Patriarchate and even Bannon, and trying to link this kind of very conservative rightist nationalism and the whole issue of gender equality and gender liberalism is really the agenda of much of this also fear and rage. So I think that we have to face this as a backlash. I mean, in the same way you would understand the backlash against Obama, against racism coming back very much. We also see very clearly a backlash everywhere against this small achievement we had in the last 50 years of women inclusion.
So let's take a few questions that we have. Did you have Jose, if you could pass the mic over there, and then we'll go to John.
I had a comment. I wanted to thank the panel for what I see as a really strong thread through everything you've done. And Catherine, you introduced definition of peace building. Charles and Deborah going into the down into the weeds in terms of what's really required. Auntie talking about the 950 things you need to do before you even can hope for 30 more, and maybe whatever. And then, of course, the dialogue of life. I underscore this to make a point. I think I've found in the classroom when I talk about the peace issues with students that one of the biggest obstacles is the very definition of peace. That in the popular mind, maybe it's different in other languages, but I doubt it. Peace is just this kind of perfect harmony. You picture a monk on a mountain meditating, and or you get nice music in the back, all of that, and I think that it becomes an invitation to more violence, because then we get disappointed. And so to the last question here, why are we in this state of turmoil? I mean, I think people have had this hope that we can finally get to peace. We can finally get to, the idea of peace is, well, I can finally now just live my life and not be bothered by problems of the world or, danger of nuclear holocaust when I was growing up, and on and on. And then when that doesn't happen, and then I have to get bothered by immigrants and, there's still poor people in the world, and I feel guilty about that. Then I react and go the other direction. So in the classroom, in some of my writing, I really want to emphasize, I've really come around to emphasizing, no, peace involves conflict. Conflict is part of human life. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is conflicting well as human beings without resorting to violence. And so that's a comment more than a question, obviously. But.
Can you get this back to John Borelli? And one of my many conversations yesterday, mostly around what's wrong with the world, but somebody said basically that his view is that he just wants things to work, just for the government to work as he gets older. That was John.
Yes, both Charles and Wolfgang referred to the Assisi Gatherings. And I wonder if a study has ever been done on how effective these were realistically on the particular crises for which they were called. There were three called by John Paul II. And the first he declared in January of 1986 that October he would be gathering people, January 25th at the close of the week of prayer, he announced it. And what's interesting is 1985 was a particularly bad year of hijackings, Middle East, South Africa. Gorbachev was new in power, and Gorbachev and Reagan. In '83, we came very close to nuclear war, so we've discovered this week with the release of new materials on exercises, NATO and the Soviet Union, that something could have gone wrong. And at the end of that month in September, is when that Russian colonel decided not to place the call and didn't believe that 4 missiles were headed to Moscow, that it was an error. And fortunately, he didn't make the call. So we had a lot of bad things going on throughout the world, and John Paul II called it. Now, did that have any particular effect? Then he did it in '93 for the Balkans. He called religious leaders together for peace in the Balkans. And then we know the last one, 2002, right after 9/11. So how would we measure how effective these gatherings were? And what would we look at if we wanted to measure the effectiveness of the Assisi peace gatherings?
You had an urgent question, so the mic up here. And is there anyone else who has anything? Because we're coming towards the close, and I want to give everyone their final minute.
I just want to share my experience from Turkey. Turkey kind of traditional community because most of the Turkish population, they are against the dialogue actually. And right now, their religious, the Ministry of the Religious Affairs, despite the minister is PhD thesis on dialogue, but they are the government is against the dialogue. My question, most of the imams in the mosque and most of the professors, they are saying that the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, the goal of this council is to convert the Muslim to Christianity, and this idea is they are sharing this idea to imams and the other people, and how the peace builders or the dialogue organizations in the West can convince the people, and our ultimate goal not to convert you to the Christianity, but just to learn each other in the grassroots level or in theological level, on academic level.
Okay, well, lots of good questions. So why don't we start with Charlie last, just a couple of minutes for each of us, each of you.
In many ways, I think Catherine could be a wonderful person to speak more directly about some of these annual gatherings of Assisi, because there were 3 of them called by the Vatican, but there's been over 30 of them now, organized by San Egidio in cooperation with the Vatican. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis all have participated in ones. And there are several anecdotal stories I can share that how peace has arisen from these meetings. Mozambique itself was very much a process of like identity, shifting the identity of San Egidio from just praying for peace to becoming more active seekers of it. The work in Algeria, the work in Libya more recently, all came out from panels held at these meetings. So in 2015, there was a panel on Libya about trying to respond to the crisis after the overthrow of Gaddafi and his government and what can be done. And over the past 2.5 years, we've been engaged in the southern Fezzan region with the tribes, bringing humanitarian assistance, negotiating ceasefires on particular cities, working for a ceasefire in Oberoi in the northern part. All that was a direct result of a long milieu of friendships with people who then connected us with people who cared and wanted to work towards peace. And then there was also just the, in the Ivory Coast in the 90s when the conflict was breaking out there, we began to multiply, not only having an annual gathering of Assisi, but multiplied it around the world. In Ivory Coast, we did a series of meetings around in the spirit of Assisi to bring people together locally and prevented the conflict escalating to from just a political conflict to a religious one. So we have lots of stories. And then there's also the issue of the past about 3-4 years really doing an effort to bring thousands of youth to the conference also, and to help shape them. And this theme of this year is really to help people have a dream of peace, a dream of an inclusive peace, and trying to really emphasize at the youth level that we can do it. And this is partnered with bringing several hundred youth from all across Europe each year to Auschwitz to kind of talk about the Holocaust, talk about anti-Semitism, talk about hatred, and not to forget about it. And so there is these meetings in the interfaith dialogue. There is direct interventions. There's a role of events in culture. And there's deficiencies in this, as Catherine can share too. I know one thing is there hasn't always been, a lot of people who are participating at the higher level have been males, because that's what the culture is. And so while there are deficiencies to these annual gatherings and how they spread around the world, there's also a lot of energy and I think a lot of hope that these meetings can be spread throughout the world. Last year, we simultaneous with the main international one, there was about 20 of them across the world, including the Philippines, several countries in Africa, Central America, all sorts of, always trying to address their cultures at the same time in this spirit of constructed, hopefully to kind of share this dream of peace across the world too. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for the questions. I try to give my answer. And I would like to start from the definition of peace. The first course that I give at Gregorian University was about peace and war in biblical tradition. In my intercultural classes, I have students from a different part of the world, and we try to define peace through their languages. It was impossible, really. So we tried to study the idea of peace reading some parts of the Bible, but the outcome was the same. It was impossible. The final outcome was during this experience that peace as a love is not forever. It is as a feeling, it changes. And our idea of peace changes in the context, as violence also. And as our need, for example. So I think that peace and peacebuilding is a work in progress, and of course involves conflicts and violence also. Peace is not every time a way of harmony, but it is a way to engage a discussion and a confrontation with the others. So, and maybe it would be useful not to confuse this idea of peace as a harmony or a pacific way of a lifestyle. So, and about Bible and the women and the inclusion of the women, this is a long story. I think that last April I was in Rome, and I met a family from Singapore. During our introduction, I told them my name, Deborah, and they answered me, "Oh, this is a biblical name. Normally in Italy, nobody knows that my name is biblical." And I asked them, "But how? Why do you know it? You are not a Catholic, you are not Christians." And they answered me, "We are a young nation, a young country, without traditions and without history. So we need and we use the traditions of other countries and of other people to build our identity and our values. I was really shocked. In Italy, nobody read the Bible as a literary text, not in the church, but as a literature, okay? And so, reading the Bible, they told me that the Bible is really inclusive, as toward also the women. And I think that we can fear the interpretations of our traditions and the Bible and the Muslim tradition and so on, but not the text, the sacred text, because the sacred texts are inclusive and sometimes they can give us criterion tools to rethink our contemporary world and to find a new perspective towards our questions. And so, okay, about secularity, it is a long discourse, but I think that in some way religion never disappeared from the world. And I think that it changed his way to stay among humanity. It's important, don't forget the legacy of a religious tradition, not to be or to become believers, but to get tools to think and to find the solution for today.
Antti.
Well, first, Catherine, thank you for convening the panel. Two comments, one on Jose's remarks on the Nobel Peace Prize, and I would like to make a proposal that somebody with the bigger influence could carry forward, which is changing the definition of violent conflict, not only based on using of arms, but the number of rape, which seems to be one of the early indicators of occurrence of armed conflict, and then continues when the arms are stopped, and make that rape war crime, not only during armed conflict, but during a violent conflict, which would change the accountability, continue to focus on the amount of pain and violence that societies have. On the impact, I would just share my observation that I for some time already ago, I stopped trying to create a dream team somewhere where we can be effective. We don't have time for that. We have to celebrate every effort scattered around where people are and have gatherings where our sustainability and spirituality are nurtured to do the right thing. And what I have witnessed is that what our institutions are really tested is that in good times we can create a story of purpose. Create, this is really the most meaningful thing to do, but if we do that in bad times, we fail the challenge. A lot of our institutions have to really rethink what is our focus. And if everyone just continues to do what they create in the good times, we will badly fail this challenge. And those decisions are based a lot on spirituality. How much are you willing to struggle and sacrifice?
A quick answer or hint to your question of in Turkey. I think interreligious dialogue on many sides, not only in Turkey, I experienced that also in the Catholic Church, also in my parish. If you are engaged in that kind of dialogue, people who are fearing about their identity are become scared and so on. So we need to strengthen this kind of identity that doesn't exclude openness to others. And many, for instance, the Algerian monks I was referring to in the beginning, they said living among Muslims there in this dialogue of life made us better Christians. So a real good dialogue does not diminish or weaken or liquidize your identity. It helps you to go deeper in your own tradition. About Assisi, I think, I mean, it's difficult to measure immediately, but I think what John Paul II did in the 80s was very important. And you can see it with Pope Benedict. He was reluctant, he was worried, he was not happy. But when he became Pope, he continued. So in that sense, that was some kind of a sea change. And maybe Assisi has even contributed to the name of the current Pope. So isn't there a Franciscan turn in the Catholic Church? And Assisi was crucial to that. About peace and conflict. I referred in the beginning to the Focolare movement, this movement has a strong emphasis on fraternity. And this is very important. But I want to recommend and just bring those two thoughts together. One of the best books on violence and religion is Jonathan Sacks' book Not in God's Name. And he says, what is the most difficult and real source of human conflicts and violence? It's sibling rivalry. So that means nothing is so important in our world of today in all levels as fraternity, but fraternity without forgetting that this is the most difficult thing to do. And this, I think, is what you said. It's peace in conflicting well. And it's difficult in the family and on broader levels, but that's what we have to do.
Following that, I think one of the intellectual challenges we all face is the tension between cooperation and competition. Because in many ways, competition does produce excellence, but it also produces tensions. And cooperation is what we all would like, and this goes right back to kindergarten and the family. I think we have a sobering challenge. The issue of what does peace building and what does dialogue achieve is a large issue, and evaluation is extraordinarily difficult, as all of you have highlighted in one way. We live in a time when there's more and more emphasis, including here at Georgetown, on statistics and on randomized control trials, logic frameworks where inputs and outputs are clearly related. But even more, I think there is a broad skepticism about dialogue as blah blah and not really achieving anything measurable. So I think it's incumbent on those of us who are committed to the processes of dialogue and to crossing the silos, bringing the global, the senior level together with what the wisdom of people at the base, of cutting across the peace, environment, education, development, all of these very, very different fields, but also using both the power of story, which is in a sense the qualitative. This is what you hear from each one of us in many ways is the anecdote and story as the way to convey both message and our own judgments. But I think we also need to find better ways to think through some of the evaluation challenges that apply to everything from meetings to academic pursuits, et cetera, because there is no escaping them in the rigorous environment, the competitive environment in which we find ourselves. And I think we do veer constantly between the tangible, the practical issues that we face and where we can make a difference in our lives and these enormous global problems that we all are grappling with. So with that, thank you very much to this wise and diverse panel and to all of you for your questions.